Hello, my name is Ileana Hernandez. I'm going to be presenting quasi-experimental designs. What are the different types and what are some threats to the internal validity? So, what are quasi-experimental designs? These experimental designs utilize experimental procedures except controlling the extraneous variables. This can include the manipulation of the independent variables and does not include random assignment. These designs still test for a cause and effect relationship, and while that does that, researchers have the responsibility to rule out any other explanations that could cause an effect in the relationship between the comparison groups and the treatment procedures. With these designs, there are three types that we will get into. They are called non-equivalent comparison group, interrupted time series, and regression discontinuity. First, we're going to talk about non-equivalent comparison group. So this is the most commonly used design that allows researchers to conduct a pre-test and a post-test with the comparison groups in the treatment procedures. Conducting pre-test allows the researchers to observe any possible group differences that could cause internal validity threats. With this, the exclusion of random assignments makes this experimental design susceptible to threats to the internal validity as well. Moreover, this type of design allows researchers to determine any significant changes in the groups from the pre-test and post-test and determine if there is an impact from the experimental procedures to the groups. An example of a non-equivalent comparison would be something like observing if students develop different attitudes after an anti-bullying program. So the researchers would implement an anti-bullying program to high school students. For the pre-test, the researchers would survey the students of their beliefs and attitudes on the bullying. The experimental procedure would then implement the anti-bullying program on the students to teach them and educate on anti-bullying and how we could prevent bullying towards other students. And then the researchers will conduct a post-test to observe if there is any effect after taking the anti-bullying course. Before we get into the other different types of experimental designs, I wanted to bring up the different threats to internal validity. There are several different kinds of internal validity that can cause an alternative explanation to an experiment in which the researchers would need to use resources to avoid these biases from occurring and causing an impact on the treatment procedures. Some examples are selection bias. This is when the groups do cause an effect on the outcome due to different ways of being tested. Attrition bias, when participants either drop out and don't complete the study, causing an impact on the experiment. Maturation bias is when changes occur with the participants, such as cognitive development, any physical development, anything like that to cause an impact. Instrumentation bias is when participants react differently to different uses of instruments. Testing bias is when taking a test can influence the participant with the outcome of the test. Regression artifact bias is when both groups show extreme scores on the pretest and improve later on in the experiment. History bias is when external events happen during the study. And then differential history bias is when one group displays a history effect while the other does not. Now we can continue into the next design, which is interrupted time series design. This type of design allows researchers to conduct multiple measurements to observe the impact of interventions, typically in a time series of data, before and after any interventions are placed. This includes tests involving statistical significance to determine any differences in patterns. They compare to other tests. This design allows it to be a stronger design since it's observing the pattern in both post and pre-test. For this type of design, the major internal validity threat would be history bias. An example of an interrupted time series could be, in this context, an effective phone ban in schools to observe students' attention span. First, researchers would pretest if the students' attention span on reading and math lessons starting February of 2022 before they implement the phone ban. Then in 2023, in February, the school would implement the phone ban throughout all high school levels. And then on the post-test, researchers would examine the students' attention spans starting from February 2023, so that would be the start of the intervention, to exactly 1 year, February 2024. And with this, it will allow researchers to determine throughout the time if the phone ban did effectively change students' attention span and if it did result in improvement of grades. Moving forward, we're going to talk about regression discontinuity design. This design allows us to determine if the group of participants meet a predetermined cutoff score from receiving treatment procedures. This requires all participants on an assignment measure, which can be used to determine if they score above or below an assigned cutoff score. Researchers utilize this design to observe efficiency in treatment, and this also does not require a random assignment. Moving forward, we'll talk about an example. So an example of regression discontinuity for this scenario would be an after-school tutoring program. Researchers would establish a cutoff score. For this scenario, it is 60%. This means if a student has a grade of 59% or less, that student does participate in the tutoring program, while others that have a grade of 60 or above do not have to participate. With this, we determine if the students had an effect from the program by seeing an increase in their scores. So those students that did pretest at a 59%, if after the tutoring program there was a jump in their score past the cutoff score, that shows that the tutoring program had an influence in the students' grades. And to conclude this presentation, these experimental designs can be commonly used to determine the cause and effect relationships between groups in experimental procedures without random assignment. All three types of the designs do share a same goal while doing different formats. And overall, it is important for the researchers to find alternative examples to avoid threats to the internal validity and to avoid any bias. And that concludes the presentation. These are my references. Thank you.